Hey everybody, welcome to another review and breakdown of The Mandalorian. Obviously, this week is the finale, and what a finale it was. And unfortunately, I don't mean that in a good way. It was extremely disappointing, which I think I should have seen coming. I mean, this is Disney Star Wars. They pretty much prove us wrong every time we think they're giving us a hint that they're going to turn away from the status quo. Where we left off in last week's episode was the Mandalorians had gone back to Mandalore. They found the Great Forge, but were immediately attacked by a number of Imperial troops wearing Beskar armor. They weren't much of a threat, but it was an ambush, and Moff Gideon showed up in his own Beskar armor. Din Djarin ended up getting captured. Paz Vizsla sacrificed himself so the others could escape, and Moff Gideon sent out a number of TIE fighters and TIE bombers to destroy the fleet. Now, what I didn't mention in the last video was that Axe Woves had escaped early on in the ambush in order to warn the fleet. So he does end up making it, and pretty much all the Mandalorians get away before the TIE fighters show up. What's weird about that is, if you remember in episode, I think it was 3 or 4, it was after Bo-Katan had joined the tribe. Paz Vizsla's son Ragnar was taken by this giant dragon bird creature, and a number of Mandalorians followed him, but had to give up before they reached wherever the nest was because their jetpacks ran out of fuel. And they revealed that this is something that had happened a number of times. Pretty much every single time a child was taken, they couldn't get them back because they didn't have enough fuel in their jetpacks. But somehow Axe Woves makes it past the atmosphere all the way to the fleet. Not only that, but he made it through all the chop and the storms in the atmosphere that made it a bumpy ride for even the ships to go through. Now, it makes perfect sense that going back down, it would be fine, which is what they did. A lot of Mandalorians basically dropped from the cruiser down through the atmosphere, which is fine because they're using gravity. But how did Axe Wolves make it through the atmosphere? Is it just that, I mean, does their group's jetpacks hold more fuel? Do they have more fuel available because they're not, nomads living in a cave? That's probably the smallest nitpick I have about this episode, but it was still weird. So anyways, Din Djarin was captured, like I said, and he actually gets away, which is a little bit surprising. I thought, given the tone of episode 7, that Din Djarin might actually die. And he did not. Nobody of consequence other than the villain died in this episode, which was disappointing, not because I wanted the good characters to die, but because the tension built up in episode 7 made it seem like something big was going to happen. And technically, something big did happen. The Mandalorians regained Mandalore and defeated Moff Gideon. But I expected something, some type of tragedy to occur with the good side of the characters. But anyways, Din Djarin is actually able to almost escape on his own from the Imperials. Grogu ends up helping with the IG-11 suit, and from there, because Bo-Katan and her group can't because they can't meet up with Din Djarin because they're kind of doing their own thing. Din and Grogu basically have to, or more so Din, he kind of has to like John Wick his way through the base and find Moff Gideon, which he does with the help of R5, who plugs into the base and not only leads Din Djarin to Gideon's position, but actually takes down those like laser field walls that we saw in episode 7 that lead up to the command center. And when he's walking through, we get another look at those tanks that Moff Gideon walked through, and it turns out those are actually clones of Moff Gideon, which I wasn't expecting, though I should have, because that dude is such a huge narcissist. Of course, he thinks he's perfect outside of having the ability to use the Force, which he outright says. So basically, his whole plan the whole time was to clone himself, use Grogu's strand DNA to give his clones the ability to use the Force and create a perfect army of himself wearing Beskar armor. Of course, Din Djarin just presses a few buttons on a console and all the tanks explode. So there go the clones. which is crazy because it basically throws away a whole plot thread that they've been building up since the beginning of season 1. I mean, the whole point of The Mandalorian, or at least how it started, was that Din Djarin found Grogu for the Empire because Moff Gideon wanted his DNA to, we know now, to create this force sensitive army of clones of himself. But as soon as we find out that they actually exist, they get destroyed. And what's funny about it is that Moff Gideon, he comes out to face Din Djarin and Grogu, and he's actually pissed off. Like he says, like you smothered them before they even had a chance to take their first breath, like they're his children or something. They're just clones. And it's funny because I mean I don't know if it would have been possible to give him the Force abilities, but I'm surprised he didn't even try to do that. And so Din Djarin fights Moff Gideon. Meanwhile, Grogu ends up actually fighting those 3 Praetorian guards. And this is kind of just one example of how badly I think the finale was written, is that the Praetorians are kind of a joke in this episode. Like when they showed up in episode 7 to face Paz Vizsla, there was just like this air of deadliness around them. Like there was real tension, not just because it was 1 against 3, but because these were deadly warriors. Like I said, they're basically the most elite warriors of the Empire. In The Last Jedi, you saw those Praetorians were able to take on Kylo Ren and Rey, who are both about Jedi Knight level in ability. And yet, Grogu is able to at least dodge them just by basically jumping around and using the Force to take their weapons away. Now, Bo-Katan also joins the fight. She ends up going one-on-one with Moff Gideon while Din Djarin helps Grogu fight the Praetorians. And again, it's even more of a joke of a fight with Din Djarin there because Grogu uses the Force to basically, move the Praetorians' weapons around every time they try and go and pick them up. He'll use the Force to push one of the Praetorians down on the ground. So it's not even a real fight. I mean, Din Djarin, who is a smaller guy than Paz Vizsla and possibly a little less experienced in hand-to-hand combat, he just defeats the Praetorians with a pistol, which is extremely lame given the fact that the Praetorians they're made for melee combat, and that's what we hope to see when they fight somebody. It's like that scene from Indiana Jones where the one dude is doing all these crazy moves with his sword, and then, Indiana just has his whip, but then he pulls out a pistol and just shoots him. I guess it's kind of funny, but it's not satisfying, especially given how heroically Paz Vizsla sacrificed himself fighting these 3 guys. And so, while all this is going on, Axe Woves had basically gotten all the Mandalorians to evacuate the cruiser. All of them are down on the surface except for him. He's still at the helm of the cruiser, and he's kind of trying to use it to fight off the TIE fighters as best he can. And when it's mostly destroyed, and I'm just going to assume that he destroyed the TIE fighters because we don't actually know what happened. There's no scene that shows us 100% whether or not the TIE fighters were destroyed. We just have to assume they were because Axe takes the cruiser severely damaged and basically points it at the Imperial base that's within the caverns of Mandalore. I also forgot to mention, kind of in between these events, Bo-Katan, the Armorer, and pretty much all the Mandalorians available except for the Foundlings kind of dive bomb into the base, and there's like this aerial battle where you got the Imperial troops using their jetpacks and the Mandalorians using theirs. Once again, the Armorer uses her hammer and tongs in this fight, which seems ridiculous at this point. It's kind of a bit beyond the suspension of disbelief for someone to use melee weapons that aren't a lightsaber that can easily cut through somebody. I have to believe that if you were to hit someone with a hammer in midair while you're both, careening towards each other with jetpacks, that your hammer would go flying. But, that doesn't happen. The Mandalorians pretty much win, especially after the ship actually goes into the caves and destroys the base. Moff Gideon ends up destroying the Darksaber, which I couldn't believe because they've spent all this time building it up. From season 1 through season 2 to the Mandalorian episode in the Book of Boba Fett, and obviously this whole season. I mean, just 2 episodes ago, they made a big deal out of Bo-Katan getting the Darksaber in order to unite the Mandalorians. But it's just broken. And it's broken because Moff Gideon He doesn't have super strength or anything. He just has he's wearing like a robotic exoskeleton made of Beskar, which is crazy. It's cool, and I'm surprised we've never seen something like that before. But yeah, he breaks the Darksaber. Din Djarin and Grogu end up joining the fight against him because they defeated the Praetorians fairly easy. Moff Gideon also has a Beskar. I don't know if you'd call it a spear, but it's something like a spear. It's like a short spear with like an electro blade at the end. And so obviously it's impervious to the Darksaber. But he loses it because again, Grogu just kind of uses the force and throws it off the ledge. And they're all kind of fighting as the cruiser is destroying the base. And Moff Gideon ends up dying by just getting caught in a wall of flame, while Grogu uses the Force to block the flame to protect Bo-Katan and Din Djarin, which is one of the laziest ways for this main villain who's been built up for 3 seasons of this series to go out. What it made me think of was that scene towards the end of Pirates of the Caribbean 3. There was the main villain, whose name I can't remember, but he was just a normal dude, but he had a lot of political power and he had taken over Davy Jones's crew. But at the end of the movie, his ship gets blown to pieces and he's slowly walking down these stairs as this explosion is growing behind him and it just swallows him up. This was an even more ridiculous version of that. Just like with the Praetorian Guards, I expected a melee showdown between either Bo-Katan and Moff Gideon or Din Djarin and Moff Gideon, where one of them defeats him with hand-to-hand combat. I mean, it just makes sense given that they're Mandalorians, and given that Moff Gideon is using Beskar armor, has enhanced his strength with the exoskeleton, had his own Beskar weapon, and is trying to obtain the Darksaber. It would have been so much more satisfying to have one of them defeat Moff Gideon in either melee or hand-to-hand combat. I mean, technically, they didn't even defeat the villain because he just got swallowed up by a wall of flame. None of them dealt a killing blow. And we also never learned what the connection was between Moff Gideon and Darth Maul. I mean, it's extremely obvious that he's wearing a helmet that has the colors associated with Darth Maul. It's another thing that they kind of threw in there. You know, obviously they wanted fans to see it and for us to recognize that as one of the helmets that was similar to the ones in the Clone Wars. But there's no answer to what that possible connection was. For all we know, Moff Gideon just liked the Super Commando, design when they served under Darth Maul. All we know about Moff Gideon at this point was that he was so arrogant that he cloned himself, believing that he was perfect outside of not having the Force. And so he used Grogu's DNA to splice into his own DNA and create clones of himself that had the ability to use the Force, and he was going to give them Beskar armor to create this quote-unquote perfect army. When you say it like that, though, I feel like that's kind of one-dimensional. Like, there should have been a bit deeper motivation than him just saying, I'm going to use this perfect army to create order in the galaxy. I mean, that's pretty much what every Imperial villain has said since the very beginning of Star Wars. And him having some connection or inspiration from Darth Maul would have just made it a lot more interesting. It would have given some depth to his character and some more history. And, speaking of not getting enough information, we still don't know who the spies were. Episode 7 was called The Spies, plural. The only spy we know of was Officer Kane, who's still, as far as we know, working inside the New Republic. Why would they call the episode Spies if there wasn't more than one? I mean, this episode basically completely annihilated my theory about the Armorer having this huge mastermind plot to get rid of all the Mandalorians not following the way, and that ended up being a whole bunch of nothing. And I'm not frustrated so much about the fact that I was wrong as much as it makes the Armorer seem really one-dimensional, because it means she really just was a zealous cult leader this whole time, which makes it kind of weird that her beliefs would switch so quickly when Bo-Katan showed up and the Armorer basically said, you can take off your helmet because you're going to unite Mandalorians. But why would she want the Mandalorians who aren't following the way? At the very end of the finale, those Mandalorians still aren't wearing their helmets, so I'm not sure what the Armorer accomplished. Yes, they retook Mandalore, but if the Mandalorians aren't following the way, one, then the armorer doesn't believe that this is the perfect version of the Mandalorian culture. And two, this could end up leading to another civil war. It just doesn't make sense, and it makes the story a lot less interesting. There's also no recognition of Paz Vizsla's sacrifice. Like, nobody says anything, not even Ragnar, who gets kind of re-anointed. He retakes the creed now that they have access to the living waters. But there's no mention of Paz Vizsla, despite the fact that he sacrificed himself to save the rest of them. He took on like 20 or so Imperial troopers and then fought 3 Praetorian guards on his own without a gun. And there's zero recognition. That that just makes me think even more that Jon Favreau was just kind of tired of the character and maybe even just tired of the series. But yeah, the Darth Maul connection ended up being nothing. My whole armorer theory with the spies ended up being nothing. A lot of the plot threads from the beginning ended up going nowhere. I mean, again, with Grogu's DNA, which is literally the starting point of the series, with Dr. Pershing, with the Darksaber, with Moff Gideon, with Grogu joining the Jedi. I mean, he's officially a Mandalorian now. He was anointed despite not being able to say the creed because Din Djarin officially adopted him. Which is also weird because apparently Din is his last name, not his first name. So Grogu is now Din Grogu. Unless that's just Din is like a name they give to foundlings who haven't been adopted or taken into a clan yet. It reminds me of season 8 of Game of Thrones in the sense that not only was the finale poorly written, but all the threads that they had been building up in previous seasons, especially surrounding Jon Snow, who was meant to be this, like, what was he called? The prince who was promised? Like this chosen leader, like chosen warrior of prophecy of the Lord of Light who is going to, kill the Night King and officially end the long night forever. And then in the finale, or not the finale, but in that final season, they just had Arya Stark kill the Night King. And Jon Snow didn't really get to do much. Sure, he killed Daenerys, but that was kind of a weird turn at the end there. Just like Game of Thrones, they built up characters to give them growth. They set up certain plot threads, and then in this season, they just kind of threw it all away. At least I think they said they're making a 4th season, so this isn't the end, but I'm pretty sure it's the end of Moff Gideon. Pershing is either dead or brain dead. Grogu is officially a Mandalorian. Those clones are destroyed, and the Darksaber's destroyed. So all that stuff that we just spent 3 seasons going through amounted to nothing. I mean, Din Djarin and Grogu are going to kind of go back to bounty hunting. We're going back to episodic adventures, which I think is the wrong direction. This series was at its best during season 2 when there was an overarching story that you could get invested in. And that's sort of what they did with this season, except the writing was terrible. And even though they kind of hit the necessary plot points, there wasn't substance to it. I mean, let's talk about Bo-Katan becoming the leader of Mandalore. I've said since the very first episode that I would like to see Bo-Katan have more screen time, that I want to see her lead Mandalore again, that I would have rather this entire series from the beginning had been about Bo-Katan instead of Din Djarin, because I find Din Djarin to be kind of boring. She got to where I wanted her to get to, but there just wasn't any struggle in that journey. I mean, there wasn't any struggle in this finale episode. Everything from the very beginning worked out for the good side. Like, Din Djarin escapes captivity. The Mandalorians in the caverns don't get killed. The Mandalorians in the cruiser don't get killed. Moff Gideon dies. The clones are destroyed. All the good characters are okay. Everybody's happy at the end. It's like the perfect end to a Disney series, but it's not a good story. What I wanted from Bo-Katan was for her to have a journey similar to that of Aragorn in The Lord of the Rings. Like, Aragorn goes from a nomad, a ranger out in the woods, and then through the 3 movies, he builds himself up to kind of reclaiming this position that his ancestors had as the king of Gondor, reuniting the kingdoms of men. And you just get this really satisfying end where, he shows up with the army of the dead to help the cavalry of Rohan take Minas Tirith at the end. They had the correct story beats there. She did all the things that she's supposed to do, except there wasn't the substance there. There wasn't the struggle in the journey. She kind of just went from point to point to point, and it's like, okay, we did the things, but why should we care about it? And that's how I felt about the whole season. You know, I kept trying to give this season a chance on an episode by episode basis. I kept saying, okay, this one wasn't great, but maybe the next one will be better. And then episode 7, they actually did a good job of raising the tension and making it seem like something important was going to happen. But everything worked out perfectly and not in a good way. There just weren't enough stakes in this season. Between Bo Katan's line of "we fight better together" and the rebuilding of IG-11, I guess the true quest of this season was about friendship all along. Now, I'm not sure how long Disney can get away with doing that, but I don't know. I mean, obviously, this isn't the end of Star Wars. We have the Ahsoka series coming up next, and there's supposedly more movies planned for the future, but I can't say that it's going to get better. I mean, what can we expect from the franchise now? Where can we expect the Mandalorian series to go? Apparently, just back to kind of where it was at season 1, except there's not this underlying threat of Moff Gideon. The chances that we'll see Ahsoka or Luke again are probably small. The chances of seeing Boba Fett again are probably small. And it's crazy because season 2 was so great, and coming off of the Book of Boba Fett, which was awful, and the Bad Batch season 2, which was another incredible disappointment, I can't help but look back at this series and think, is this kind of the status quo going forward? Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the worst series of a Star Wars show ever. There were interesting moments here and there, but overall the story just didn't matter. The stakes that they had built up just didn't amount to anything in the end, which is kind of how the whole Star Wars franchise feels like. I think the broken darksaber kind of represents the Mandalorian franchise. You built it up as this really important thing, and then just leave it broken in a CGI explosion. That's kind of where I see this series going, possibly the whole Star Wars franchise. But tell me what you think in the comments section. Did you like the finale? How did you feel about this whole season? And what do you think is going to happen with the future of The Mandalorian? If you enjoyed this video, I would appreciate it if you hit that like and subscribe button, as well as the notification bell so you never miss out on a new video. Thanks for watching.